In the gray, windswept spring of 1869, as the empire tightened its aging grip on its distant Pacific outposts, and as the United States emerged, bloody but unbroken from civil war, British Columbia stood at the crossroads. Hemmed by mountains, isolated from Canada by thousands of miles of untamed wilderness, and freshly overshadowed by Americans' acquisition of Alaska, it found itself surrounded, as it were, by a rising imperial tide. The temptations of American annexation would reach their high water mark that year, driven by restless miners, impatient merchants, and the heady promise of manifest destiny fulfilled. The drama unfolds with all the texture of one of history's favorite themes: distant capitals issuing distant commands, local actors struggling for autonomy, and great empires rising and receding like tides. British Columbia, that still young colony on the edge of nowhere, was less a coherent political entity than it was a scattering of ambitions, hopes, and gold dust. The United States, meanwhile, was a colossus. In 1865, it had fielded the largest standing army in the Western Hemisphere. Though the army was largely demobilized after Appomattox, the memory of it, what it had accomplished, what it could still be, remained a sobering reality for the fragile colonial outposts across the Pacific Northwest. The Americans had won their Civil War with steel and rail and gunpowder, and they turned next to their ancient continental hunger. Manifest destiny was not merely a slogan. It was, in the words of the historian Anders Steffensen, a providential conviction that the United States had been chosen by God to expand across the North American continent. That conviction did not stop at the 49th parallel. It eyed Vancouver Island, the Fraser River, and the coal seams of Nanaimo as surely as it had coveted Texas and California. In the fevered years following the American Civil War, the United States turned its diplomatic sights not just outward, but backward, towards Britain, whose neutrality had, in American view, been more theoretical than real. Chief among their grievances was the CSS Alabama, a Confederate commerce raider, built in the shipyards of Birkenhead near Liverpool, under a false name and British indifference. For nearly 2 years, she prowled the Atlantic like a ghost, sinking Union merchant vessels with merciless efficiency. When the war ended, the damage was tallied, not only in ships, but in pride. The United States demanded reparations from Britain, $15 million in gold, or, as some voices proposed, something more strategic, the secession of British Columbia. Let England pay in land, if not in coin, one American senator thundered, sensing opportunity. While the idea never gained serious traction in London, it was a chilling reminder to British policymakers and their Pacific colony, isolated, vulnerable, and sparsely defended. It could be seen as a pawn on the chessboard of empire and grievance. As historian Howard Jones observed, the Alabama claims were more than a demand for justice. They were a warning shot across the bow of imperial complacency.
Annexation by the United States of Canada's various dominions and territories and colonies had long been an ambition of American statesmen, and the record is clear on this. It goes back even right to the War of American Independence, when Nova Scotia and Quebec were invited to join the Continental Congress and become colonies or parts of the new forming United States. But this had been rejected, as you know. But in the 1850s and 1860s, the movement towards annexation of the northern territories was encouraged and increased in intensity. And the newspaper persons had a great deal to do with this, and so did the politicians. Polk, in his election win in 1844, talked about 54-40 or fight. And that meant that British Columbia was the ham and the sandwich and would soon be eaten up.
Nowhere was this gravitational pull more strongly felt than in San Francisco, the mercantile engine of the American Pacific. By the 1860s, it was already a sprawling, swaggering city. Athens and Gomorrah, in equal measure, wrote American historian Kevin Starr, and it loomed large over British Columbia, economically and culturally. The gold of the Fraser Rush and later the Caribou made its way not to London or Montreal, but southward to the mint and markets of California. American merchants dominated trade. Steamboats came from San Francisco. Newspapers echoed San Francisco. Fashions, politics, and credit lines all bore the imprint of that rising city. In this shadow, British Columbia's isolation became not just physical, but existential. The purchase of Alaska by the United States in 1876 for $7.2 million by Secretary of State William Seward deepened that sense of abandonment. With Alaska under the American flag, British Columbia seemed squeezed between two advancing jaws, wrote Canadian historian Margaret Ormsby. British Columbia was now an imperial orphan, geographically closer to San Francisco than Ottawa, psychologically closer to Sacramento than to Westminster. Attitudes in the U.S. toward British Columbia varied from the aggressive to the indifferent to the opportunistic. Some Americans saw annexation as inevitable, a mere matter of time and local will. The New York Times wrote in 1867, "British Columbia lies in our lap. The only question is whether we will stoop to pick it up." Others, especially in business circles, believed annexation would be a mutual benefit. British Columbia's resources in exchange for American capital and infrastructure. And so the agents of annexation, many of them American miners and businessmen, set to work. Some were honest in their aims, some ruthless. Among them were former 49ers who had drifted north in the wake of the California gold boom, bringing with them not only tools and tents, but also Jeffersonian ideas about liberty, markets, and Republican governance. They found a British colony still shackled to autocracy. The Legislative Council was still stacked with appointees. There was no responsible government, no real democracy to speak of, and it bred resentment. "It is a colony governed like Gibraltar," sneered one disaffected settler in British Columbia.
Now, the movement of the press and the movement of the politicians in Congress and the Senate continued to harp on this. It made for good political argument about the expansionist tendency of the American society and the concept that the Western Hemisphere belonged to the United States and that to some degree Canada was a mistake and would, as they like to say, would sooner or later, in the case of British Columbia, fall like a ripe apple into the hands of the United States. And there were successive secretaries of state who had this point of view. And it comes particularly to attention of Secretary of State William Seward, who we treat with great respect because he is the one who acquires Alaska in 1867, therefore pinching British Columbia between Washington State on the one hand and Alaska on the other.
The discontented began to gather, quietly at first, then with growing boldness, in saloons and boarding houses. Over the smell of wood smoke and whiskey, they passed around petitions, whispered strategies, and invoked the American Declaration of Independence with a mixture of irony and hope. At the heart of their frustration was a deep belief that London neither knew nor cared what happened on the Pacific edge of empire. British officials in Victoria were wary. They understood that British Columbia's population, especially in gold rush districts, was riddled with American citizens or American sympathizers. The colony's political leaders, such as Frederick Seymour and later Anthony Musgrave, avoided reforms that might stir the pot further. As historian Gene Barman noted in The West Beyond the West, British Columbia was governed not so much by political principle as by a nervous desire not to rock the boat. Responsible government, The colony's political evolution towards self-rule was postponed deliberately because, in the words of British Colonial Office advisor Sir Henry Holland, a legislature with real power might vote itself into the Union. The annexation movement in British Columbia was not the work of radicals or outcasts. It was led by prominent merchants, professionals, and former colonial officials, men of stature and property. Chief among them was Armand de Cosmo, the fiery journalist, newspaper editor, and later Premier of British Columbia. Though he would eventually champion Confederation with Canada, in the mid-1860s, de Cosmos gave voice to widespread dissatisfaction with British rule through his British Colonist newspaper, railing against the colony's economic malaise and absentee governance. Other figures were more explicit in their advocacy. Leonard McClure, an Irish-born customs official and merchant in Victoria, was one of the architects of the 1869 annexation petition. Alongside him was Henry Stamp, a sawmill magnate with American ties, and George Hunter Carey, a former Attorney General of Vancouver Island, who was sympathetic to closer integration with the United States. They were joined by a coalition of businessmen, ship owners, and American-born settlers who had prospered in British Columbia but now feared economic decline. These men viewed annexation not as treason, but as a pragmatic patriotism, a means to rescue the colony from oblivion. Thus, the 1869 petition and the crisis. The formal petition, signed by 104 prominent citizens of Victoria, was circulated and sent directly to President Ulysses S. Grant. It asked, in bold and unambiguous terms, for the United States to annex British Columbia. "We pray," it read, "that Your Excellency will take such steps as may be necessary to secure the annexation of the colony to the United States." It was not the first whisper of such an idea, but it was the first serious, organized attempt to make it real. The response from Washington was ironically cool. Grant, weary from war and corruption scandals, had no appetite for annexation fights. The State Department let the petition die in silence. In London, the Colonial Office was alarmed, but not surprised. They knew the Crown's grip was slipping. They needed a counteroffer, and quickly. Confederation became that offer, the alternative to Americanization. Canada, newly united in 1867, extended the hand of political union westward. What Britain could not offer in proximity or prosperity, Ottawa promised in rails and rights. The promise of a transcontinental railway linking British Columbia to the rest of Canada was made in 1870. It would be the iron bond of Confederation, Prime Minister John A. Macdonald declared. Annexation died, not with a bang, but with a railway charter. Still, it had become a close-run thing. The annexation movement of 1869 had exposed the fragile nature of British control on the Pacific coast. It was not loyalty, but convenience that bound British Columbia to the Empire, wrote historian Philip Buckner. The Americans had offered speed, democracy, and a share in a rising republic, but Canada, in the end, offered continuity and a railway. And so British Columbia turned north and east, not south. The eagle did not take the salmon, but it had tried. In the words of William Manchester himself, history does not announce its turning points with fanfare. It leaves us, instead, with the ghost of what might have been. The annexation petition of 1869 is one such ghost, still haunting, still whispering, still asking, what if? Join us next time for part 10 of the Canada History Society's 20-part series as we explore Episode 10, The Option of Confederation with British Columbia, a British North America from sea to sea.